In the military, respect isn't given, it's earned. But what happens when assumptions about gender, age, and appearance cloud judgment so completely that a seasoned captain makes the biggest mistake of his career? Picture this: a bustling military command center, filled with the tension of an ongoing crisis. Uniformed personnel rush between stations, radios crackle with urgent communications, and at the center of it all stands a young woman in perfectly pressed fatigues. She appears calm, almost serene, as chaos swirls around her. Then enters Captain Morrison, 23 years of service, chest full of ribbons, and an ego to match. He takes one look at this woman and makes an assumption that will haunt him for the rest of his military career. In his mind, she's clearly lost, probably a new recruit who wandered into the wrong building. What Captain Morrison doesn't know is that he's about to learn the hardest lesson of his life about respect, hierarchy, and the dangerous cost of prejudice. Because the woman standing before him isn't just any soldier. She's about to utter 5 words that will make everyone in that room freeze. 5 words that will expose his ignorance in the most humiliating way possible. This is the true story of Colonel Sarah Chun, the youngest person ever to command a joint military operation. And the day she had to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Braxton as Sarah Chun adjusted her uniform for what would become one of the most pivotal days in military history. At 32 years old, she had already broken more glass ceilings than most people encounter in a lifetime. But today would test everything she had learned about leadership, respect, and the price of being underestimated. Sarah's journey to this moment began in the cramped apartment above her family's restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown. Her parents, immigrants from Taiwan, had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they never had. While other kids played video games, Sarah spent her afternoons helping with the restaurant and her evenings buried in books about military strategy and leadership. Her fascination with the military wasn't born from any family tradition. In fact, her parents were horrified when she announced her intention to join the Army instead of pursuing the medical career they had envisioned for her. The path hadn't been easy. From the moment she stepped onto the grounds of West Point Military Academy, Sarah faced challenges that went far beyond the rigorous academic and physical demands. She was one of only a handful of Asian American women in her class, and the whispers followed her everywhere. Some questioned whether she belonged there. Others wondered if her admission was simply to fill diversity quotas. Sarah heard them all, but instead of letting the doubt consume her, she channeled it into fuel for her determination. During her first year at the academy, Sarah encountered her first real taste of the prejudice that would follow her throughout her career. During a particularly challenging field exercise, her squad leader, an upperclassman named Bradley Webb, repeatedly questioned her decisions and openly expressed doubt about her capabilities. When Sarah successfully led her team through a complex tactical scenario that had stumped several other squads, Webb dismissed it as luck. But their tactical instructor, Colonel Martinez, had been watching carefully. He pulled Sarah aside after the exercise. "Chun," he said, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "You've got something special. Real leadership isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about making the right decisions under pressure and inspiring others to follow you into hell if necessary. I saw that today. But you're going to face people like Webb your entire career. The question is, are you going to let their narrow minds limit your potential, or are you going to prove them wrong so convincingly that they have no choice but to respect you?" That conversation became Sarah's North Star. She threw herself into her studies with even greater intensity, excelling not just in traditional military subjects, but also in psychology, international relations, and emerging technologies. She understood that the modern military was evolving rapidly, and success would require more than just tactical brilliance. It would demand the ability to navigate complex political situations, understand different cultures, and adapt to new forms of warfare. By her senior year, Sarah had risen to the rank of brigade commander, the highest position a cadet could hold. She commanded respect from her peers not through intimidation or favoritism, but through consistent excellence and an uncanny ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. Her strategic thinking impressed even the most skeptical instructors, and her leadership style, firm but fair, demanding but supportive, earned her loyalty from subordinates who initially doubted her. After graduation, Sarah's career accelerated at an unprecedented pace. Her first assignment took her to Fort Campbell, where she served as a platoon leader in the 101st Airborne Division. The transition from academy life to active duty presented new challenges. Her soldiers were predominantly older men, many with combat experience, and their initial reaction to their young, female platoon leader ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. Sergeant First Class Marcus Johnson, a grizzled veteran with 3 combat deployments, made his feelings clear during their first formation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "With all due respect, some of us have been doing this longer than you've been alive. Maybe you should consider letting experience guide your decisions." Sarah looked at Johnson calmly, then addressed the entire platoon. "Sergeant Johnson raises an important point about experience. Experience is valuable, and I respect every one of you for the service you've given to our country. But experience without growth becomes stagnation, and stagnation in the military can be deadly. I'm not here to replace your experience with my inexperience. I'm here to combine your knowledge with fresh perspectives to make this platoon the most effective unit in the division." She paused, making eye contact with each soldier. "Over the next few weeks, I'm going to prove to you that leadership isn't about age, gender, or time in service. It's about making the right decisions, caring for your soldiers, and accomplishing the mission. Give me that chance, and I promise you won't be disappointed." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Sarah implemented new training protocols that challenged her soldiers while keeping them engaged. She took time to learn about each person under her command, their backgrounds, their goals, their concerns. When Private Rodriguez struggled with marksmanship, Sarah spent her own free time working with him until he qualified. When Specialist Martinez received devastating news from home about his father's illness, Sarah worked with the Red Cross to arrange emergency leave and made sure his duties were covered without penalty. Most importantly, Sarah led from the front. During a particularly grueling field exercise in the swamps of Louisiana, when her soldiers were exhausted and morale was low, Sarah was right there with them, carrying her own pack, plus extra water for those who were struggling. When they finally completed the exercise ahead of schedule and with higher scores than any other platoon, even Sergeant Johnson had to admit she had earned his respect. "Ma'am," he said privately after the exercise, "I was wrong about you. You're not just a good leader for someone your age or gender. You're just a damn good leader, period." Sarah's reputation began to spread throughout the base and beyond. Her innovative approaches to training and her ability to maintain high morale while achieving exceptional results caught the attention of higher command. When the base hosted a joint exercise with international partners, Sarah was chosen to lead one of the key components despite being the most junior officer in the group. The exercise simulated a humanitarian crisis in a hostile environment, requiring coordination between multiple military branches and civilian agencies. Sarah's ability to communicate effectively with partners from different cultures and her strategic thinking under pressure impressed everyone involved, including General Patricia Hayes, who was observing the exercise. General Hayes had a reputation for being tough but fair, and she rarely offered praise lightly. After watching Sarah coordinate a complex rescue operation that saved dozens of simulated casualties while maintaining tactical advantage, the general requested a private meeting. "Lieutenant Chun," General Hayes said, gesturing for Sarah to sit in her temporary command post, "I've been watching your career with interest. Your instructors at West Point spoke very highly of you, and what I've seen today confirms their assessment. You have a rare combination of tactical brilliance and emotional intelligence that the military needs, especially as we face increasingly complex global challenges." Sarah sat at attention, unsure where the conversation was heading. "I'm recommending you for accelerated promotion and assignment to the Strategic Planning Division at the Pentagon," the general continued. "It's unusual for someone with your limited experience, but these are unusual times. We need leaders who can think beyond conventional warfare and understand the interconnected nature of modern conflicts." The assignment to the Pentagon was a dream opportunity, but it also meant leaving the soldiers who had become like family to her. As Sarah prepared for her new role, she reflected on the lessons she had learned. Respect couldn't be demanded or inherited. It had to be earned through consistent action and authentic leadership. Gender and ethnicity might make the path more challenging, but they didn't determine the destination. At her farewell ceremony, Sergeant Johnson presented Sarah with a plaque signed by every member of the platoon. The inscription read, "To Lieutenant Chun, you taught us that leadership has nothing to do with what you look like and everything to do with who you are. Thank you for making us better soldiers and better men." As Sarah boarded the plane to Washington, she carried with her the confidence that comes from proven success and the wisdom that comes from overcoming adversity. She had no way of knowing that her greatest test was still ahead, or that the skills she had developed would soon be put to the ultimate test in a situation that would define not just her career, but her legacy. The Pentagon assignment opened new doors and new challenges. Sarah found herself working on classified projects that dealt with emerging threats and cutting-edge military technology. Her ability to think creatively and her deep understanding of both human nature and military doctrine made her invaluable to her superiors. She worked 18-hour days, analyzing intelligence reports, developing strategic recommendations, and occasionally briefing senior leadership on critical issues. It was during this time that Sarah first encountered the kind of institutional resistance that would later explode into the confrontation at Fort Braxton. Despite her growing reputation and proven track record, there were still those who saw her rapid advancement as suspicious or undeserved. Whispers in Pentagon corridors suggested she was being fast-tracked because of her gender and ethnicity rather than her abilities. Sarah knew about the gossip, but she had learned long ago that the best response to doubt was excellence. She continued to exceed expectations, earning the respect of colleagues and superiors through her work ethic and results. When a crisis erupted in Eastern Europe that required immediate strategic response, Sarah's analysis and recommendations helped shape the military's response plan. Her work earned her a commendation and, more importantly, the attention of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The rapid promotions continued. Captain at 25, Major at 28, Lieutenant Colonel at 30. Each advancement brought new responsibilities and new skeptics, but also new opportunities to prove herself. Sarah commanded a battalion in Afghanistan, where her innovative counterinsurgency tactics helped reduce civilian casualties while increasing mission effectiveness. She earned a Bronze Star for her leadership during a complex operation that rescued captured aid workers while minimizing collateral damage. By the time Sarah reached the rank of colonel at 32, she had become something of a legend in military circles. Her success story was often cited as evidence of the military's commitment to diversity and merit-based advancement. But, for every admirer, there seemed to be a critic who questioned whether her achievements were truly her own. The assignment that would lead to the confrontation at Fort Braxton came suddenly. Intelligence had identified a complex security threat that required immediate response from multiple military branches and civilian agencies. The situation was delicate, involving potential international implications and requiring someone with both tactical expertise and diplomatic sensitivity. Sarah was chosen to lead the Joint Task Force, making her the youngest person ever to command such a diverse and high-stakes operation. The appointment made headlines and generated both praise and criticism. Supporters pointed to her proven track record and unique qualifications. Critics questioned whether someone so young could handle the pressure and whether her appointment was more about optics than capability. As Sarah prepared for what would become the defining moment of her career, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. Every challenge, every doubt, every success had prepared her for this moment. She had learned that true leadership meant being willing to stand firm in the face of disrespect while never losing sight of the mission or the people depending on her. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned about leadership, respect, and the courage to stand up for oneself in the face of overwhelming prejudice. Captain Morrison's mistake was about to become a lesson that would resonate throughout the military for years to come. The emergency briefing came at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning that would forever change the trajectory of multiple military careers. Sarah Chun received the encrypted message while reviewing intelligence reports in her Pentagon office, the glow of multiple monitors casting shadows across her determined features. The message was brief, but carried the weight of national security. Report to Joint Operations Command immediately. Operation Steel Resolve requires your immediate attention. Operation Steel Resolve had emerged from a perfect storm of international tensions and domestic security concerns. Intelligence agencies had identified a coordinated threat involving foreign actors attempting to infiltrate critical infrastructure systems while simultaneously planning to exploit civil unrest in major American cities. The operation required unprecedented cooperation between military branches, civilian law enforcement, and international allies. Most importantly, it needed a commander who could navigate the complex political and cultural sensitivities while maintaining operational effectiveness. General Patricia Hayes, now a four-star general and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had personally recommended Sarah for the assignment. The recommendation had sparked heated debate among senior leadership. Some argued that despite Sarah's impressive record, the mission was too critical to risk on someone so young. Others questioned whether a colonel, regardless of capability, could effectively command officers of equal or superior rank from different branches. General Hayes had listened to the objections with characteristic patience before delivering her decision. "Gentlemen, I understand your concerns about Colonel Chen's age and rank. However, this operation requires someone who can think beyond traditional military doctrine while maintaining tactical precision. Chen's record speaks for itself. She's the only officer I know who has successfully commanded joint operations, earned respect across cultural boundaries, and demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking this mission demands." She paused, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the room of senior officers. "Moreover, the nature of this threat requires someone who understands both conventional warfare and the complexities of modern asymmetric conflicts. Chen has proven herself in both arenas. I'm not asking you to like this decision, but I am ordering you to support it." The briefing for Operation Steel Resolve took place in a secure facility beneath the Pentagon, where Sarah found herself surrounded by some of the most senior military officers in the country. The scope of the operation was staggering, coordinating responses across 12 major metropolitan areas, managing assets from all military branches, and working with allied forces from 6 different countries. The timeline was aggressive, the stakes were enormous, and failure could result in catastrophic loss of life. Colonel James Morrison was among the officers present for the initial briefing. At 45 years old, Morrison represented everything traditional about military leadership. He had earned his rank through steady advancement, conventional thinking, and an unwavering belief in the importance of hierarchy and protocol. His service record was solid if unremarkable, and he had commanded respect through authority rather than inspiration. Morrison's first reaction upon seeing Sarah enter the briefing room was confusion. She looked impossibly young to be wearing colonel's eagles, and her presence among so many senior officers seemed incongruous to him. When the briefing officer announced that Colonel Chun would be commanding the operation, Morrison's confusion turned to disbelief, then to barely concealed resentment. During the briefing, as Sarah outlined her strategic approach to the mission, Morrison found himself analyzing her credentials rather than her presentation. He noted her youth, her gender, her ethnicity, and concluded that her rapid advancement must be the result of political correctness rather than genuine merit. In his mind, the military was being compromised by social engineering, and Sarah's appointment was proof of this dangerous trend. Sarah, for her part, was acutely aware of the skepticism in the room. She had faced doubt before, but never at this level, never with so much at stake. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the unspoken questions about her qualifications, the barely hidden resentment from officers who felt they deserved the command more than she did. But she also knew that dwelling on these attitudes would undermine her effectiveness. Her presentation was flawless. She outlined a comprehensive strategy that addressed every aspect of the threat while minimizing risk to both military personnel and civilians. Her plan incorporated lessons learned from recent conflicts, emerging technologies, and diplomatic considerations that many traditional military leaders overlooked. By the time she finished, even some skeptics had to admit that her approach was sound. General Hayes concluded the briefing with clear instructions. Colonel Chun will establish her command center at Fort Braxton, which will serve as the primary coordination hub for the operation. All participating units will report to her for the duration of this mission. I want to be absolutely clear about the chain of command here. This is Colonel Chen's operation, and her authority is absolute within the scope of this mission. After the briefing, Morrison approached his longtime friend and fellow officer, Colonel David Webb, who shared his concerns about Sarah's appointment. Webb had been Morrison's classmate at the War College and shared his traditionalist views about military leadership. "This is insane, Jim," Webb said quietly as they walked through Pentagon corridors. "They're putting the entire operation in the hands of someone who was probably still in high school when we were earning our first combat ribbons. What message does this send to real military leaders?" Morrison nodded grimly. "It's everything that's wrong with today's military. Merit has been replaced by diversity quotas, and experience has been devalued in favor of political correctness. Mark my words, David, this operation is going to be a disaster, and when it fails, it'll be real soldiers who pay the price." The conversation continued over drinks that evening, where Morrison and several like-minded officers voiced their frustrations about what they saw as the erosion of traditional military values. They convinced themselves that Sarah's appointment was a dangerous experiment that would ultimately prove their point about the importance of conventional leadership approaches. Meanwhile, Sarah was working 18-hour days to prepare for the operation. She studied intelligence reports, coordinated with allied forces, and developed contingency plans for every conceivable scenario. Her team of analysts and strategic planners, handpicked for their expertise, worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail was perfect. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, Sarah's deputy commander, had initially been skeptical of serving under someone younger than herself. Santos was a career officer with extensive combat experience and a reputation for tactical brilliance. However, her first meeting with Sarah had quickly dispelled any doubts about the young colonel's capabilities. "Colonel Chun," Santos had said during their initial planning session, "I'll be honest with you. I had reservations about this assignment. But after reviewing your strategic assessment and seeing how you've organized this operation, I can say without reservation that you're exactly the kind of leader this mission needs." Sarah appreciated the honesty and the support. "Thank you, Maria. I know this situation is unusual, and I respect your willingness to give me a chance to prove myself. Your experience is going to be crucial to our success, and I'm counting on your input to help me avoid the kind of mistakes that inexperience can create." The relationship between Sarah and her deputy became a model of mutual respect and complementary skills. Santos brought tactical expertise and institutional knowledge, while Sarah contributed strategic vision and innovative approaches. Together, they created a command structure that maximized the strengths of every team member. As the operation's launch date approached, Sarah made a decision that would have significant implications for the confrontation to come. She decided to conduct the initial phase of the mission from Fort Braxton's main command center rather than a separate facility. This choice was driven by practical considerations. The main command center had superior communication equipment and could accommodate the large number of personnel required. But it also meant that Sarah would be operating in a space typically reserved for more senior officers. Fort Braxton had a long and distinguished history, and its command center was considered sacred ground by many career officers. The facility had been the nerve center for numerous critical operations over the decades, and officers who worked there took great pride in its traditions and protocols. For many, the sight of a young, female colonel commanding operations from this prestigious location would be jarring. Morrison arrived at Fort Braxton 3 days before the operation was scheduled to begin. His role was to coordinate air support elements, a position that required close collaboration with the command center, but didn't directly place him under Sarah's authority until the operation commenced. This bureaucratic distinction would prove crucial in the events that followed. During his first day at the base, Morrison made a point of visiting the command center to assess the situation. What he saw confirmed his worst fears about the operation. Sarah was clearly in charge, directing activities with quiet authority while dozens of personnel followed her instructions. To Morrison, the scene represented everything wrong with modern military leadership. Morrison's resentment was further inflamed when he overheard several junior officers expressing admiration for Sarah's leadership style. One young lieutenant mentioned how impressed he was with her ability to explain complex strategic concepts in terms that everyone could understand. A sergeant praised her for taking time to learn the names and backgrounds of key personnel, something that many senior officers never bothered to do. "She's not like other colonels," the sergeant had said. "She actually listens when you talk to her, and she treats everyone with respect regardless of their rank. But don't mistake kindness for weakness. When she gives an order, you know she means business." These comments infuriated Morrison, who interpreted respect earned through character as somehow less legitimate than respect commanded through rank and authority. In his worldview, military hierarchy was sacred, and Sarah's approach threatened the very foundation of military order. The tension built steadily over the 3 days leading up to the operation. Morrison found excuses to visit the command center frequently, observing Sarah's methods and looking for signs of weakness or incompetence. He was disappointed to find that her operation ran smoothly and efficiently, with clear communication and high morale among the staff. On the evening before the operation was scheduled to begin, Morrison attended a briefing where Sarah outlined the final preparations and contingency plans. Her presentation was comprehensive and professional, addressing every concern raised by the assembled officers. Even Morrison had to admit privately that her planning was thorough and her strategic thinking was sound. However, Morrison's respect for Sarah's professional competence was overshadowed by his fundamental belief that she didn't deserve her position. In his mind, any success she achieved was tainted by the circumstances of her advancement. He convinced himself that when the operation began and real pressure mounted, her inexperience would show and her authority would crumble. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would expose the dangerous cost of prejudice and the power of earned respect. Sarah had proven her capabilities through consistent excellence, but she was about to face a challenge that would test not just her professional skills, but her personal courage. Morrison's assumptions about gender, age, and authority were about to collide with the reality of modern military leadership in a way that would leave lasting impact on everyone involved. As both officers prepared for the operation that would define their legacies, neither could have predicted that their encounter would become a case study in leadership, respect, and the evolution of military culture. The command center at Fort Braxton was about to witness a moment that would be remembered for decades to come. The morning of Operation Steel Resolve dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected the tension that hung over Fort Braxton like a heavy blanket. Sarah Chun arrived at the command center at 0500 hours, 2 hours before the operation was scheduled to begin, but she found the facility already buzzing with activity. Technicians ran final diagnostics on communication systems, intelligence analysts reviewed last-minute updates, and officers from multiple branches coordinated their respective responsibilities. Sarah moved through the controlled chaos with calm efficiency, checking on each station and ensuring that everyone understood their roles. She had learned long ago that the success of complex operations often depended on seemingly small details, and she made it her practice to verify that every element was in place before committing to action. Lieutenant Colonel Santos approached her with a steaming cup of coffee and a status report. All systems are green, Colonel. Communications are crystal clear, intelligence feeds are stable, and all participating units have confirmed readiness. The Allied Forces liaison reports that international partners are standing by and awaiting your signal. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully and reviewed the status report. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. It wasn't anything she could quantify, call it intuition, experience, or simply the natural anxiety that came with commanding such a critical operation. She had learned to trust these instincts, but she also knew that dwelling on undefined concerns could undermine her effectiveness. "Thank you, Maria," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark. "I want you to personally verify the backup communication protocols one more time. If something disrupts our primary systems, I don't want any delays in switching to alternatives." Santos nodded and headed off to complete the task, leaving Sarah to make her final preparations. She reviewed her strategic notes one last time, checked her appearance in the reflection of a computer monitor, and took a moment to center herself mentally. Leadership at this level required absolute focus, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by personal concerns or office politics. At 0630, 30 minutes before the operation was scheduled to commence, Sarah began her final briefing to the assembled command staff. Representatives from each military branch were present, along with civilian law enforcement liaisons and intelligence coordinators. The briefing room was packed with some of the most experienced officers in the military, and the weight of their combined expertise and expectation was palpable. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "In 30 minutes, we'll initiate the most complex joint operation attempted in recent history. Our success will depend not just on our individual competence, but on our ability to function as a unified team. Every person in this room has specific responsibilities, but more importantly, each of you has the authority to make critical decisions within your area of expertise." She paused, making eye contact with key personnel throughout the room. "I want to be absolutely clear about communication protocols. If you see something that concerns you, speak up immediately. If you identify an opportunity that isn't in our current plans, bring it to my attention. This operation succeeds through collaboration, not through rigid adherence to hierarchy." The briefing continued for 20 minutes, with Sarah addressing questions and clarifying responsibilities. Her approach was methodical but flexible, authoritative but inclusive. By the time she concluded, even officers who had initially been skeptical of her appointment had to admit that her command style was effective. As the briefing concluded and officers dispersed to their positions, Captain Morrison made his way to the communication station where he would coordinate air support elements. His role was crucial but secondary to the main operation, a fact that grated on his ego. In his mind, someone with his experience should have been given overall command rather than relegated to a support function. Morrison's resentment had been building throughout the morning as he watched Sarah command the operation with apparent ease. Her confidence seemed to come naturally. Her orders were clear and decisive, and her staff responded to her leadership with genuine respect rather than mere compliance. For someone who believed that command authority should be earned through years of conventional advancement, Sarah's natural leadership ability was both impressive and infuriating. At 0700 hours sharp, Sarah gave the order to initiate Operation Steel Resolve. All stations, this is command. Operation Steel Resolve is now active. Execute Phase 1 according to plan. Good luck, everyone. The command center erupted into controlled activity as dozens of personnel began coordinating the massive operation. Communication boards lit up with status reports from field units across multiple time zones. Intelligence screens displayed real-time updates from surveillance assets. The air was electric with the focused energy that came from highly trained professionals executing a carefully planned operation. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Field units reported successful positioning, surveillance assets provided clear intelligence, and international partners confirmed their readiness to support American operations as needed. Sarah moved between stations like a conductor directing a symphony, orchestrating the complex operation with apparent ease. Morrison watched this display with growing irritation. In his experience, major operations always encountered significant problems, and the fact that Sarah's command seemed to be proceeding without major issues struck him as suspicious. He convinced himself that she was either incredibly lucky or that the real challenges hadn't yet emerged. At 0815, Morrison's cynicism seemed to be validated when the first crisis emerged. Intelligence analysts detected unexpected movement from hostile forces in two separate areas, suggesting that the enemy had somehow anticipated the operation and was attempting to counter it. The discovery sent a wave of tension through the command center as officers realized that their careful plans might be compromised. Sarah's reaction to the crisis became a masterclass in leadership under pressure. Rather than panic or blame the intelligence failure, she immediately convened her senior staff to assess the situation and develop response options. Her calm demeanor had a steadying effect on everyone around her, and her clear thinking helped focus the group on solutions rather than problems. "We have two possibilities here," Sarah announced to her senior staff. "Either we've been compromised and they know about our operation, or this movement is coincidental and we're seeing the response to something else entirely. Maria, what's your assessment?" Lieutenant Colonel Santos reviewed the latest intelligence. "The movement patterns suggest preparation for defensive action rather than offensive operations. I think they're responding to indicators of increased activity rather than specific knowledge of our plans." Sarah nodded. "I agree. Which means we have an opportunity here. They're preparing for something, but they don't know exactly what. If we adjust our timing and approach vectors, we can turn their defensive preparations into a disadvantage." She moved to the tactical display and began outlining modifications to the operational plan. Her changes were creative but grounded in solid military doctrine, taking advantage of the enemy's defensive positioning while maintaining the operation's primary objectives. Within 15 minutes, she had developed and communicated a revised plan that actually improved their tactical advantage. Morrison watched this display with grudging admiration and growing frustration. He had hoped that the crisis would expose Sarah's inexperience and provide justification for his skepticism. Instead, her response had been textbook perfect, demonstrating exactly the kind of adaptive leadership that modern military operations required. The revised operation proceeded with even greater success than the original plan. By 0930, field units were reporting significant progress toward their objectives, and it was becoming clear that Sarah's leadership had transformed a potential setback into a strategic advantage. The command center buzzed with positive energy as personnel realized they were participating in something special. It was at this moment of triumph that Morrison made the decision that would define both his legacy and Sarah's. Frustrated by her success and driven by his fundamental belief that her command was illegitimate, he decided to assert what he believed was his rightful authority. Morrison approached the central command station where Sarah was coordinating with field commanders. She was in the middle of a critical communication with units preparing to execute the most sensitive phase of the operation, requiring her complete attention and focus. Morrison positioned himself directly beside her and waited for her to finish her transmission. When Sarah concluded her communication and turned to brief her staff on the next phase, she found Morrison standing uncomfortably close to her position. His body language was aggressive, his expression was stern, and his voice carried a tone of authority that was completely inappropriate for their relative ranks and responsibilities. "Excuse me, miss," Morrison said loudly enough for nearby personnel to hear, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think you might be in the wrong place. This is a restricted command area, and civilian personnel aren't allowed here during active operations." The command center fell silent as if someone had suddenly turned off all sound. Officers who had been engaged in urgent communications paused mid-sentence. Technicians looked up from their screens. The steady hum of electronic equipment seemed to grow louder in the sudden absence of human activity. Sarah stared at Morrison for a long moment, processing what had just happened. She had faced disrespect before, but never anything this blatant, this public, or this professionally destructive. Morrison hadn't just questioned her authority. He had denied her very presence in the command center, treating her as if she were a lost civilian who had wandered into a restricted area. The implications of Morrison's statement were staggering. He had effectively declared that he didn't recognize her rank, her authority, or her right to be commanding the operation. Worse, he had done so in front of dozens of personnel from multiple branches of the military and allied forces, undermining not just Sarah's authority, but potentially compromising the entire operation. Lieutenant Colonel Santos took a step forward, her face flushed with anger at the disrespect shown to her commanding officer. Several other officers tensed visibly, clearly outraged by Morrison's behavior. The tension in the room was electric, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath waiting for Sarah's response. Sarah remained perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was actually only a few seconds. She was acutely aware that her response to this moment would define not just her own career, but would send a message about respect, authority, and leadership that would resonate throughout the military for years to come. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the unspoken questions about how she would handle this unprecedented challenge to her authority. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried with crystal clarity throughout the silent command center. Her tone was calm, professional, and absolutely certain, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "Captain Morrison," she said, her eyes never leaving his face, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about the chain of command here." Morrison's expression shifted from arrogant confidence to uncertainty as he realized that Sarah knew exactly who he was and what he had just done. The fact that she had used his rank and name meant she was fully aware of the significance of his behavior, and her calm response suggested she was about to deliver consequences he hadn't anticipated. Sarah took a step forward, closing the distance between them while maintaining perfect military bearing. Her next words would become legendary in military circles, repeated in leadership courses, and remembered as a defining moment in the evolution of modern military culture. The storm that had been building throughout the morning was about to break, and its impact would be felt far beyond the walls of Fort Braxton's command center. The silence in the command center stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah Chun stood facing Captain Morrison in what had become an arena where decades of military tradition, personal prejudice, and modern leadership philosophy were about to collide in spectacular fashion. Every person present understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Sarah's mind raced through her options in the fraction of a second before she spoke. She could handle this quietly, pulling Morrison aside for a private conversation that might preserve his dignity while establishing her authority. She could escalate through proper channels, filing a formal complaint that would result in disciplinary action but might disrupt the operation. Or she could address the situation directly, publicly, and definitively in a way that would leave no doubt about the chain of command and the consequences of disrespect. The choice she made would define not just this moment, but the trajectory of her entire career. More importantly, it would send a message to every person in that room about what the military stood for in the 21st century. Was it still an institution where authority derived primarily from traditional demographics and conventional advancement patterns, or had it truly evolved into a meritocracy where leadership was earned through competence and character? Morrison's face showed a mixture of arrogance and growing unease as he waited for Sarah's response. He had committed himself to this confrontation based on his fundamental belief that her command was illegitimate, but something in her calm demeanor was beginning to suggest that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that had become her trademark, but there was an underlying steel that made every word ring with absolute finality. "Captain Morrison," she said, her tone so controlled it was almost conversational, "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands the situation clearly." She turned to address the entire command center while keeping Morrison in her peripheral vision. Her movement was deliberate and confident, transforming what had been a personal confrontation into a leadership lesson for everyone present. For those who may not be familiar with the command structure of Operation Steel Resolve, I am Colonel Sarah Chun, and I have been designated as the commanding officer for this operation by direct order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her words carried clearly through the silent command center, and she could see understanding dawn on faces throughout the room. Some officers nodded slightly, confirming their knowledge of her authority. Others, particularly those from other bases who might not have been fully briefed on the command structure, showed expressions of surprise and growing comprehension. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Captain Morrison has just suggested that I am a civilian who has wandered into a restricted area during an active military operation. This statement raises several interesting questions about his understanding of both the chain of command and the nature of this mission." Morrison's face began to flush as he realized the magnitude of his error. He had assumed that Sarah was a junior officer or civilian contractor, but her words and demeanor made it clear that not only was she a colonel, she was the colonel in charge of the entire operation. The implications of what he had just done began to sink in, and panic started to replace arrogance in his expression. "However," Sarah continued, her tone remaining perfectly professional, "I believe Captain Morrison's confusion can be easily resolved." She took a step closer to Morrison, her bearing erect and her gaze steady. The entire command center seemed to lean forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Then, Sarah delivered the 5 words that would echo through military history and become a legend in leadership circles around the world. "Everyone here reports to me." The words hit the command center like a physical force. Morrison's face went from red to pale in an instant as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. He had just publicly disrespected and attempted to dismiss the commanding officer of a major joint military operation in front of dozens of witnesses during an active mission. But Sarah wasn't finished. Having established her authority, she now demonstrated the kind of leadership that separates truly great commanders from merely competent ones. "Lieutenant Colonel Santos," Sarah called without taking her eyes off Morrison, "please remind the captain of the organizational structure for Operation Steel Resolve." Santos stepped forward with barely concealed satisfaction. She had been furious at the disrespect shown to her commanding officer, and she was clearly pleased to have the opportunity to set the record straight. "Yes, ma'am," Santos replied crisply. "Captain Morrison, Colonel Chun is the designated commanding officer for Operation Steel Resolve by direct appointment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. All personnel assigned to this operation, regardless of branch affiliation or permanent duty station, report directly or indirectly to Colonel Chun for the duration of the mission." Morrison stood frozen as the reality of his situation became clear. He had not only insulted a superior officer, but he had done so in the most public and humiliating way possible. Every person in the command center now knew that he had mistaken his commanding officer for a lost civilian, revealing both his prejudice and his ignorance of the mission's leadership structure. Sarah observed Morrison's reaction with calm professionalism. She could see the panic in his eyes, the growing understanding of what his behavior meant for his career and reputation. But rather than exploit his vulnerability for personal satisfaction, she chose to demonstrate the kind of leadership that builds rather than destroys. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, her tone shifting slightly towards something that might almost be characterized as gentle. "I believe this misunderstanding arose from incomplete information about the command structure. Perhaps you weren't fully briefed on the organizational details of this operation." It was a face-saving gesture that Morrison didn't deserve, but which demonstrated Sarah's understanding that effective leadership sometimes required mercy as well as authority. She was offering him an opportunity to acknowledge his mistake without completely destroying his dignity. Morrison struggled to find words. The gracious nature of Sarah's response somehow made his behavior seem even more egregious. He had acted on pure prejudice, assuming that a young, Asian American woman couldn't possibly be in command of such an important operation, and his assumptions had been proven spectacularly wrong. Colonel Chun, Morrison finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I apologize for my error. I was not properly briefed on the command structure. It wasn't a complete acceptance of responsibility. He was still blaming insufficient briefing rather than his own prejudice, but it was an acknowledgement of his mistake. Sarah nodded slightly, accepting the apology while making it clear that the matter was far from resolved. Captain Morrison, Sarah said formally, you will report to Lieutenant Colonel Santos for reassignment to duties more appropriate to your understanding of this operation structure. We cannot afford confusion about the chain of command during such a critical mission. Morrison's relief at not being immediately relieved of duty was palpable, but Sarah's words made it clear that there would be consequences for his behavior. Reassignment during an active operation was a significant disciplinary action that would become part of his permanent record. As Morrison prepared to leave the command center, Sarah addressed the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an operation to complete. I trust that any questions about authority and responsibility have been resolved. Let's get back to work. The command center exploded back into activity as personnel returned to their duties with renewed energy and focus. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact would be felt for decades. Sarah had demonstrated that respect must be earned through competence rather than demanded through position, and that true authority comes from the ability to lead effectively under pressure. Word of the confrontation spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire. Within hours, every person on the base knew about Captain Morrison's spectacular mistake and Colonel Chin's handling of the situation. The story grew in the telling, with each version emphasizing different aspects of what had become known as the Declaration. Some versions focused on Morrison's humiliation, describing in detail his shock when he realized whom he had just insulted. Others emphasized Sarah's professionalism, noting how she had managed to establish her authority while offering Morrison a measure of dignity in defeat. All versions agreed on one point. Everyone had witnessed something extraordinary. The reaction among the military personnel was overwhelmingly positive for Sarah and damaging for Morrison. Officers who had initially been skeptical of her appointment now spoke admiringly of her handling of the crisis. Enlisted personnel appreciated her willingness to stand up for herself while maintaining professionalism. Even international allies who had heard about the incident expressed impressed respect for her leadership style. Morrison's reputation, on the other hand, was effectively destroyed. His assumption that a young, female, Asian American colonel couldn't possibly be qualified for high command had been exposed as both wrong and prejudiced. Worse, his public humiliation made him a symbol of outdated thinking in a military that was working to modernize its culture and embrace merit-based leadership. The success of Operation Steel Resolve only enhanced Sarah's reputation. The mission was completed ahead of schedule and under budget, with minimal casualties and maximum strategic impact. Intelligence agencies credited the operation with disrupting several potential terrorist attacks and significantly degrading enemy capabilities in the region. Sarah's leadership during the operation became a case study in military academies around the world. Her ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, her inclusive command style, and her handling of internal challenges were all cited as examples of modern military leadership at its best. For Morrison, the consequences extended far beyond professional embarrassment. His commanding officer at his home base received a detailed report of his behavior, and his fitness for promotion was called into serious question. The military's emphasis on character and leadership meant that public displays of prejudice and disrespect for superior officers were career-ending events. The incident also sparked broader discussions about diversity, merit, and leadership in the modern military. Progressive officers cited the confrontation as evidence of the need for continued cultural change, while traditionalists argued that Morrison's mistake was individual rather than systemic. The debate raged in military journals, professional development courses, and officer clubs around the world. Sarah, for her part, remained focused on her duties and her mission. She understood that the confrontation had made her more famous than she had ever wanted to be, but she also recognized that her response had sent an important message about the kind of military leader she intended to be. She had proven that respect could not be demanded based on assumptions about who should or shouldn't hold authority. It had to be earned through competence, character, and consistent performance. The legend of the Declaration continued to grow, but For Sarah, it was simply another day at the office, another challenge overcome through preparation, professionalism, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong exactly where you are. 6 months after what became known throughout military circles as the Declaration. The ripple effects of that 5-minute confrontation continued to reshape careers, policies, and perspectives across all branches of the armed forces. Sarah Chin sat in her new office at the Pentagon, now wearing the stars of a brigadier general at the unprecedented age of 33, reviewing reports from the cultural sensitivity training programs that had been implemented in response to the incident. The promotion had come with her successful completion of Operation Steel Resolve, but everyone understood that her handling of the Morrison confrontation had played a significant role in fast-tracking her advancement. Military leadership had recognized that Sarah represented exactly the kind of modern leader the armed forces needed as they navigated an increasingly complex global landscape. The story of the confrontation had taken on a life of its own, becoming required reading in leadership courses at West Point, the Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy. Military historians had already begun analyzing the incident as a turning point in the evolution of military culture, marking the moment when old assumptions about authority and leadership were definitively challenged. For Sarah, the fame was both gratifying and burdensome. She had never sought the spotlight, preferring to let her work speak for itself, but she understood that her visibility carried responsibility. Young officers, particularly women and minorities, looked to her as proof that the military truly was a meritocracy where talent and character mattered more than demographics or traditional advancement patterns. The phone in her office rang, interrupting her review of the training reports. Her aide announced that General Patricia Hayes wanted to see her immediately. Sarah made her way through the Pentagon's corridors to the chairman's office, wondering what crisis or opportunity awaited her attention. General Hayes greeted her with the slight smile that those who knew her well recognized as an expression of deep satisfaction. "Sarah, please sit down. I have some news that I think you'll find interesting." Sarah settled into the chair across from Hayes's desk, noting the stack of folders marked with various levels of classification. Whatever was coming, it was clearly significant. "The Morrison incident has had far more impact than I think any of us initially anticipated," Hayes began. "The Joint Chiefs have been reviewing our leadership development programs, and your handling of that situation has become the gold standard for professional crisis management under pressure." She opened one of the classified folders and extracted a document that Sarah recognized as a formal military directive. "More importantly, your success with Operation Steel Resolve and the way you managed that confrontation has attracted attention from the highest levels of government. The president has asked me to discuss a new assignment with you." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. High-level assignments brought tremendous opportunities, but also enormous pressure and responsibility. "What kind of assignment, ma'am?" Hayes leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "The Pentagon is creating a new position, Director of Strategic Leadership Development. The role would involve overseeing leadership training across all branches, with particular emphasis on preparing the military for 21st-century challenges. It's essentially about institutionalizing the kind of leadership approach you've demonstrated." The magnitude of the proposal took Sarah's breath away. The position would give her influence over the development of military leaders for generations to come, the opportunity to shape the culture and values of the entire armed forces. It was exactly the kind of role she had dreamed of when she first decided on a military career. "The appointment would come with promotion to Major General," Hayes continued, "making you the youngest 2-star general in military history. Are you interested?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely." Meanwhile, Captain Morrison was experiencing the other side of the incident's lasting impact. His reassignment following Operation Steel Resolve had been to a desk job at a remote logistics base, effectively ending any hope of advancement or meaningful contribution to military operations. The official record showed only that he had been reassigned due to operational requirements, but everyone in his professional circle knew the real reason. Morrison's wife, Rebecca, had initially been supportive, believing that her husband had been unfairly treated for what she saw as a minor misunderstanding. However, as more details of the incident became known and as the story spread through military spouse networks, she began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "Jim," she said during a difficult conversation in their base housing kitchen, "I've been talking to other wives, and they're telling me things about what happened at Fort Braxton that you never mentioned." Morrison stared at his coffee, unable to meet his wife's eyes. "It was a misunderstanding, Beck." The command structure wasn't clearly communicated. Rebecca shook her head. That's not what people are saying. They're saying you assumed a colonel was a lost civilian because she was young and Asian and female. They're saying you humiliated yourself and embarrassed the entire base. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful in Morrison's life. As Rebecca pressed him for the truth, he was forced to confront the prejudices that had driven his behavior. For the first time, he had to acknowledge that his assumptions about Sarah Chun had been based on bias rather than fact, and that his public humiliation had been entirely self-inflicted. I don't know who you are anymore, Rebecca said finally. The man I married believed in fairness and respect. The man I married would never have treated a fellow officer the way you treated Colonel Chun. Morrison's marriage would not survive the year. His career was effectively over, and his personal life was collapsing under the weight of his own prejudice and poor judgment. He became a cautionary tale told in leadership seminars, a reminder of the professional and personal costs of allowing bias to override judgment. The contrast between Morrison's fate and Sarah's success became a powerful symbol within military culture. Officers who had previously held similar prejudices were forced to confront the reality that the military was changing, and that those who failed to adapt would be left behind. The cultural sensitivity training programs that emerged from the incident were comprehensive and mandatory for all personnel. They used the Morrison confrontation as a case study, analyzing both his mistakes and Sarah's response to illustrate principles of modern military leadership. The programs emphasized that respect must be based on competence and character rather than assumptions about who should or shouldn't hold authority. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, who had been promoted to colonel following her excellent performance as Sarah's deputy, found herself in high demand as a speaker and trainer for these programs. Her first-hand account of the incident and her analysis of effective leadership under pressure made her presentations compelling and impactful. The most remarkable thing about Colonel Chin's response, Santos would tell audiences, wasn't that she established her authority. Any competent officer could have done that. The remarkable thing was how she did it. She managed to be firm without being cruel, authoritative without being vindictive. She showed Captain Morrison more respect than he had shown her, even while making it clear that his behavior was unacceptable. The incident also sparked important conversations about diversity and inclusion throughout the military. Progressive officers argued that Morrison's assumptions revealed systemic problems that needed to be addressed through policy changes and cultural reform. Conservative voices countered that Morrison's behavior was an individual failing rather than evidence of institutional bias. Sarah found herself at the center of these debates, though she tried to stay focused on her professional responsibilities rather than becoming a political symbol. In interviews and public appearances, she consistently emphasized that her success was the result of preparation, hard work, and the opportunities provided by a military that truly rewarded merit. I don't want to be seen as a diversity success story, she said in a widely quoted interview with Military Times. I want to be seen as a successful military officer who happens to be a woman and happens to be Asian American. The military gave me opportunities based on my performance, not my demographics, and that's the way it should be for everyone. The broader impact of the confrontation extended beyond military culture into civilian society. The story was covered extensively in mainstream media, with many outlets using it as an example of positive change in traditionally conservative institutions. Sarah's handling of the situation was praised by leadership experts across various industries, and her approach was cited in business schools and corporate training programs. A year after the incident, Sarah was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony at West Point, her alma mater. Standing at the podium where so many military legends had spoken before her, she addressed the newest generation of military leaders about the lessons learned from her confrontation with Morrison. Leadership is not about demanding respect because of your rank or your position, she told the assembled cadets. Leadership is about earning respect through your actions, your character, and your competence. When someone challenges your authority, you have a choice. You can respond with anger and defensiveness, or you can respond with professionalism and strength. She paused, looking out at the sea of young faces that represented the future of American military leadership. Captain Morrison made assumptions about me based on what I looked like rather than who I was or what I had accomplished. Those assumptions cost him his career and his reputation. But they also provided an opportunity for all of us to learn about the kind of leaders we want to be. The speech was met with thunderous applause, but Sarah's favorite moment came afterward when a young female cadet approached her with tears in her eyes. General Chun, the cadet said, "Thank you for showing us that we belong here. Thank you for proving that respect is something we can earn, not something we have to beg for." As Sarah left West Point that day, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. A 5-minute confrontation born from one man's prejudice had become a defining moment not just for her career, but for military culture as a whole. The declaration, "Everyone here reports to me," had become more than just an assertion of authority. It had become a symbol of earned leadership and professional competence. Morrison's story, meanwhile, served as a stark reminder of the consequences of allowing prejudice to override judgment. His assumptions about who could and couldn't be a military leader had cost him everything he had worked for throughout his career. He became a cautionary tale, a reminder that in a merit-based organization, character and competence mattered more than traditional expectations. The transformation that began with that confrontation continued to ripple through military culture for years to come. New policies ensured that leadership positions were filled based on demonstrated ability rather than conventional advancement patterns. Training programs emphasized the importance of recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias. Most importantly, a new generation of military leaders emerged with a deeper understanding of what respect truly meant. Sarah's legacy extended far beyond her own remarkable career. She had proven that true authority comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through consistent excellence and principled leadership. Her 5 words, "Everyone here reports to me," would be remembered long after both she and Morrison had left active duty, serving as a reminder that in the modern military, leadership was about competence, character, and the courage to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The confrontation that could have destroyed careers instead transformed an entire institution, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the simplest declarations of earned authority and professional respect.